Hello, my name is Elsa Vasseur. I'm a professor at McGill in animal science, and I have a research chair in industrial relations on the durable, sustainable life of cows, dairy cows. So all of the research on longevity began in this first context. So basically, producers have trouble keeping their cows. What that means is that we'll talk about results a little bit later on, but essentially longevity is following third lactation. So if I use the work done by Doris Pavard from the University of Laval, we have cows in fourth lactation and they start to be profitable at third lactation. That's when they start to provide a contribution that makes sense. Now, what's been stated here is that if we improve comfort, we can also improve longevity. And so I will present the results, epidemiological results that have been done in Canada. Here we have the results from my colleague Marianne Bissot, and we looked at these in some 100 farms in Thai stall. So what's the condition between, or the link between comfort and productivity? So what we saw is that if we take average production, when we increase rest time, or if we change levels so that things be comfortable for cows, then we have production that is positive. For comfort and longevity, when we compare the measures that we'd undertaken on the farm, and here, for example, we had the number of stalls with wet bedding or rest time with other points and lactanet data here. The replacement rate is what we noticed is that when we had very wet bedding, then it would increase replacement. And when we had rest time that was not quite adequate, we decreased the third lactation. And then now with profitability, what we've calculated is the margin on replacement cost. And at the same time, we had the increase in average time because we increased the margin. However, when we had stalls with wet bedding, we decreased this margin per percentage and where we were involved. These results were measured within a number of farms. We stated that there was a connection between comfort and longevity, or comfort and profitability. And so what we looked at was when we looked at the industrial research chair established in 2016 from McGill. So what we did is we revisited the concept of longevity on data collected for herds in Quebec, and there are three aspects there. And what were the benefits and the types developed to try to select the best candidates to hold on to for absolute profitability. So what do we know about the current status of longevity in Canadian dairy herds in Quebec, but also elsewhere around the world? So this is a critical literature review that we've just published, and if there is work with Gabriela Plado, a student, a doctoral student. So first of all, we wondered what the longevity and what longevity was, how we defined it, and how it was measured. And the first aspect around longevity is the aspect of culling. So we have two types of culling, voluntary and involuntary. So with voluntary, the cow is healthy and it is fertile and culled due to low milk production. And for involuntary, that's when we have either an issue with health or fertility, and that's why an animal would leave the herd. These are the results of incidences of culling in Canadian herds. So these are the results that we find in different countries around the world, but we can see that there's a big difference there. And culling is mostly one and not the other. Longevity, what is longevity? Well, there are three types of definitions which are most used in literature. So true longevity, which is animals' ability to delay culling; functional longevity, which is the animal's capacity to delay culling and adjust for milk yield; and residual longevity, so residual, where it is adjusted for all other breeding traits. For the measures, we have two types of measures. And so this is for the rest of the presentation. There are some measures that where the capacity is in place to be able to stay within the herd, the indication if the animal is living or born, and duration, life duration for each stage of life, so the productive stage of life. And so what we did was that we tried to understand the connection between production and longevity, for example. So we looked at what the countries were that had production results and longevity. And what we did was, after looking at data production and after looking at longevity, it was pretty complicated. So what we did is that we looked at where we were able to find information to calculate productivity, which stated that we had 10 countries, the 10 dairy producer countries. We looked at trends over time, production, and the like. And what we found was that from 1960 to today, production has increased dramatically, which is good news. But the biggest portion of production was for Brazil, with increases at 18%. And in the 60s, it was the US with an increase of 129. So improvements, yes, indeed. What are those? Well, it's associated with nutrition, genetics, animal health, and the like. When we look at aspects on longevity, well, we're sort of elsewhere here, and we've got three types of different scenarios. So first of all, most of the countries, so 6 countries out of 10, have a decrease in longevity. The lowest is for Ireland with a decrease of 0.9. And the strongest decrease is for Poland with a decrease, as you see on the slide. Now, maybe a little bit less surprising is longevity in New Zealand, that has increased. And so these are the 10 countries that we've been able to work with where there has been an increase in longevity. And there are 3 countries for which longevity has remained the same. The Netherlands, Germany, and the US. And when you look at the information, we did have longevity that was already pretty low. So lactation that were a smaller number of days. So what are the factors that can explain longevity differences? If you look at milk yield, for instance, here we have 2 times more milk yield in Canada than in New Zealand. And when we look at longevity, it's 2.5 times lower than in Canada and or in Canada than in New Zealand. And so the production systems cause challenges. So longevity have the same characteristics, and that's where animals are being in stalls. And for New Zealand, for example, we have a system based on pasturing with transfer. And these are systems for which we have some lower systems, and where we have issues around lameness and mastitis, which are the main causes for issues. So what did we learn about this literature review? Well, we learned that there was no longevity and there were no standardized measures. It's pretty complex. We had to do calculations to be able to look at the longevity, and the measures that are used focus mainly on end of life, and we don't have any details around which cows will be selected and which not. What we learned as well is that for longevity, dairy production does not necessarily impact a farm, but the production systems for countries for which longevity has decreased, we have a various number of characteristics. For next steps, well, it's a question of developing initial indicators to identify the animals that are in this situation. It's a question of production profitability and practices, and that could explain the differences in profitability. And are there any differences in profitability with our stage of life and whatnot? And now this leads us to the second point of the presentation, which is what is the impact of well-being and longevity? And I want to present some results that have just been published that are the master's results as indicated here. What we indicated and what we asked as questions, which are what was in place, and what is this the first time that we know whether the impact of the first lameness or mastitis incidents can have impacts, and what are the final economic results connected with production here. So in the same way that for Gabriel's work, what we did here is that we used herd data from Lactanet, so Quebec data. We had 848 herds. We were able to keep 120 herds for which we had good registries, and then 39,000 animals on one end and 15,000 on the other end for the lameness. And so we worked with 4 lactation stages, and we looked at production variabilities and everything accumulated, and economic variables, and the food margin. And what we found was that disease occurrence compromises cow productivity and profitability. And then in the chart that you see here, this is production, the margin, the food margin, and then gross profit. What you see as well is the difference between animals that have had an episode of mastitis compared to those that did not. And when you have the healthy cows compared to those that have had mastitis in lactation, so positioning at the beginning and positioning at the beginning, middle, and end of lactation, we have lower production and a lower food margin. And then when we look at the difference between feed and margin, we have a loss of profit of 3 times higher in animal feed. Now, another important thing is that contrary to the literature, an episode at the end of lactation can be simply exhausting. And so when we look at the results for lameness, here again, when we compare healthy cows in the first portion, when there's lameness around lactation, we have lower production, lower net margin, and lower food margin as well. And so when we compare the net margin to the food margin, and we look at the comparisons, we have 1.6 times more than the other. And so what does this tell us here? This tells us that when we look at the different lactation stages where the first event can occur, we realize that we can have lameness during the transition period, and that generates challenges in cattle. And so we can have up to 1,000 kilos less, and so an impact of 1,000 kilos. Now, the other thing is that lameness and mastitis increase the issues by 2 times, 3 times, and the way in which we've got our chart here, and the percentage of culling on cows where you've got mastitis, where we have different stages in lactation, we realize that for mastitis, it's a question of having a culling episode in the middle of lactation, both for lameness, where we increase significantly the risk of culling compared to other events, which are the crossed out events in this slide here. So what did we learn? We learned that lameness and mastitis will decrease production and profits at up to 1,000 kilos and $1,000 per sick cow. And that is, these are the numbers. And we increase the risk of culling. It can be increased 2 times. And We also learned that the decision to cull or keep a cow in the herd was not necessarily dictated by losses of production or profit. And so for next steps, it will be interesting to develop tools to understand the real value of profits and to allow people to better select, farmers to better select for better profitability. And that is how you can guide yourself into the last portion now. So then we started to look at what the tools were to help us select the best candidates and to keep for another lactation. This is the work that we're in the process of looking at for results and valuing results. And this is the work that has been done. Daniel Warner, who's a postdoc with me, has done some of this research. And then we worked in conjunction with our partners, very specifically veterinarians from the University of Montreal, and we worked with producers and veterinarian advisors. And what we tried to understand was how decisions are made for culling. So there are two very important levels, two bits of information that are very important. First of all, decision making for keeping the cow is often based on events that happen during current lactation and not things that happened previously. And that confirms the results that we had received. And the second thing that we found was that producers often underestimate the cumulative costs, but it would be much better if they looked at animals throughout time. And that's where we said, okay, finally, we could develop a decision making based on cost benefit analysis based on our capacity to keep a cow in the herd for an additional lactation. And then we looked at the differences between a cow that remained and did not during lactation.
So out of 114 dairy herds, this is a database that we have and we looked at. And finally, we did this with 23,000 cows for which we have many lactations. As for the costs, we look at 4 types of costs: feed, diseases, breeding services, additional health issues in our database. And the breeding services and any additional costs. So as for profits, we looked at 3 values. Using the Burton and Marie, we look at the milk value, the food margin, and the gross profit. All right, the 2 types of comparisons. Actually, we compared the remaining cows in the herd and the cows that come out of the herd, and we did two types of analyses. We looked at the duration of productive life. We evaluate lifetime costs, divide whether we want to divide by 2, 3, 4 lactations. And we also looked at the data on each lactation throughout the productive life by looking at all lactations. So if we look at the difference here, we have 2 graphs. On the left, we have the costs, and on the right, we have the profits. But each time we represent the difference between the cows that came out of the herd and those who remain for a subsequent lactation. So when we look at the costs, we look at the feed costs, the additive costs, because we accumulate lactations that increases costs. However, we know that the costs are higher for the cows that come out at the end of a lactation. That's rather good news. However, when we look at profits, we see that the milk value is higher for cows that come out. But when we look at the net margin, we're pretty much flat. There's no significant effect on the net margin. What does that mean? It means that finally, when we cull, when we remove the feed costs and sickness costs, we end up with pretty much a balanced approach. And that if we consider both costs and profits, profitable cows could be identified and could be kept and have been replaced sometimes. So if we looked at the whole thing, if we really looked at the accumulated costs and profits, we could identify those costs, those animals that we should keep, and that way we could keep the most profitable animals in the herd. Second aspect, calculating the contribution of each cow to the profitability of the herd, we developed a prototype as a decision helping tool. Two aspects. There was a visualization aspect that allows us to look at the whole herd as the whole compared to the population, how this herd compares to the general population. And we looked also at individual cows. So those are two ways that the producer could look at these cows and see how they compare with the other animals in the herd. So the thing is to make a comparison with the peers and cohort effects depending on the region. And also we could make a comparison compared to yourself. How did I do and where can I improve compared to what I did? So this is a prototype that was developed with the counselors, veterinarians, and producers. It's not finalized, but I will show you here the elements that would come into this dashboard as a decision-making assistance tool. We have a choice. Either we choose cost aspects only or cohort aspects, and the two graphs allow us to visualize both the costs and the profits at the same time. So here, we will select one herd for which we are going to look at the costs. Here, we will look at costs related to sickness, and we will look also at the gross margin. So in terms of profits, what we look is that we look at each lactation for the cow, and we follow the cow throughout the lactations 1, 2, 3, 4. Then what this tells us indeed is that we're compared to the quartiles. When we have a cow that is above the cross, what it tells us is that this cow has sickness costs that are higher than the rest of the herd. If they're under that cross, it means that this cow has lower sickness costs for diseases. For gross profit, is the reverse. Gross profit increases when it goes up and reduces when it's under. What does it show? It shows that a cow that had started its first lactation firmly remains non-profitable throughout lactations, and we see that the disease costs and that will continue to increase if the cow has started on the wrong foot. So what did we learn here? We learned that there are possibilities to identify cows that contributed most to the herd profitability, and also cows with high initial costs may likely never be profitable. But we want to develop a decision-making tool that will look at this element. And we also have to consider cumulated costs and revenues in the decision-making process, and not just one lactation. So this is a prototype. There is work to be done to try to improve it, but the idea was to develop decision-making tools that are simple and interactive with support tools and useful benchmarks. So where are we heading to in this? I invite you to go and look at the thesis of 180 seconds by Gabriel. I'll present here a few aspects that we will look at. First of all, we will look at the fetal diseases or diseases before birth. We'll look at what is the effect of the cow condition around conception and during gestation, and how this could have an impact on longevity, profitability, and productivity. The second level of work will be look at the whole rearing period. Before the cow becomes a cow, we want to look at what are the management practices to be used during the first stages that could be associated with a future state of welfare, longevity, and profitability. And the last aspect that we will look at is basically what is the link between the responses of the cow, of the herd as a whole, and the longevity, profitability, and productivity. And those are also results that are presented as part of the forum as a poster by Gabriel, where we look at the uses and results of ProAction and how this is linked to the results that we can find in the database. So a lot of work. There's a whole team behind here. I want to thank my whole team, all the students who are behind that research. And that's what it looks like today. Rather, it's not in person, but it's all on Zoom in a mosaic. And here, I want to take the time to thank the funding agencies, the industrial partners, and the NSERC for the funding of our work.